They did not push Evelyn Whitaker down the stairway to heaven. They did something colder. They left her there and walked away. Rain slid over the white stone steps in silver sheets, washing mud from her dress and warmth from her skin, until the whole mountain seemed to breathe around her like some ancient creature waiting to decide whether she was worth keeping alive. Evelyn lay on her right side, her cheek pressed against the stone, her empty left sleeve pinned beneath her ribs where her arm should have been. Above her, the moon temple rose through the storm, pale and distant, its bells silent, its doors closed. Below her, lanterns bobbed farther and farther away as the Silver Pine pack returned home without looking back. She could still hear Marianne Whitaker's voice through the rain, smooth as polished ice. The moon will take what the pack cannot carry. Brielle had not even sounded angry when she said it. That had hurt more. Anger meant Evelyn mattered enough to disturb someone. Brielle had only sounded relieved. The last lantern vanished between the black pines, and Evelyn understood with a terrible calm that no one was coming back for her. Not Derek Hollis, who had once promised to build her a porch facing the western ridge. Not the elders, who had watched her carry water, mend clothes, and soothe frightened children even after the accident made everyone stop saying her name kindly. Not the family whose last name she still carried like a borrowed coat. Her breath shook out of her in small white clouds. She tried to rise, but her boots slipped on the wet stone, and pain sparked along her shoulder where old scars met fresh bruises. For a moment, shame burned hotter than fear. She had survived the mill wheel that took her arm. She had survived the whispers afterward. Half-mate, burden, bad omen. She had survived learning how to button a dress with one hand, braid her own hair against a wall, and smile when people spoke slowly to her, as if losing an arm had emptied her mind. But being left here, on the sacred steps where dying wolves were carried when their families could no longer bear the waiting, felt like something meant to erase her completely. Evelyn's fingers closed around the small handkerchief tucked inside her collar. The cloth was damp now, but she could still feel the raised outline of the sparrow her mother had stitched in blue thread years before. Small birds survive by knowing where to hide, her mother used to say. But Evelyn was tired of hiding. A faint flutter moved beneath her cloak. She looked down. Pressed against her chest was the injured sparrow she had picked up before the ceremony began, its wing bent, its heartbeat frantic against her palm. She had hidden it when Marianne ordered her to climb, because no creature deserved to be left in the rain simply because it was too small to defend itself. "I know," Evelyn whispered, her voice thin beneath the thunder. "I am scared too." The bird trembled. She curled her body around it as much as she could, giving the last of her warmth to something even weaker than herself. Wind climbed the mountain and pushed cold rain beneath her collar. Somewhere in the forest below, a wolf howled, low and distant. Evelyn closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to remember the sound of a kitchen fire, her mother humming, sunlight on clean sheets, the idea of home before home became a place where people measured her worth by what was missing. Another sound came then. Not thunder, not wind. Hooves on stone. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Evelyn forced her eyes open. Through the curtain of rain, a dark rider stood at the foot of the stairway to heaven, still as judgment beneath a black cloak edged in silver. His horse tossed its head, but the man did not move. Evelyn could not see his face clearly, only the pale gleam of eyes fixed on the broken omega the pack had abandoned. She should have called for help. She should have begged. Instead, she lowered her chin over the trembling sparrow and whispered, "Please do not hurt it." The rider went very still. Then, without a word, he stepped down from his horse and began climbing toward her. The man climbing toward Evelyn moved with a silence that did not belong to any ordinary rider. Each step should have echoed against the wet stone, yet the storm seemed to fold around him, lowering its voice as if even the mountain knew him. Evelyn tried to push herself upright before he reached her. Pride, foolish and stubborn, made her attempt it twice. Both times her right hand slipped, and both times she caught the sparrow against her chest before she caught herself. The rider stopped 3 steps below her. Rain ran from the edge of his hood, hiding most of his face, but not the silver of his eyes. "Who left you here?" he asked. His voice was deep, controlled, not gentle exactly, but careful in the way strong hands were careful around cracked glass. Evelyn did not answer at first. The law of Silver Pine had been carved into her long before it had been spoken aloud that night. A rejected Omega did not accuse her pack. A damaged daughter did not shame the family that had already decided she was shame enough. She looked past him toward the pine road below, where the last traces of lantern light had disappeared. Only then did the memory rise, sharp and bright. Marianne standing in the temple courtyard with her dark wool coat buttoned to her throat. Brielle beside her in pale blue satin, dry beneath an attendant's umbrella, one gloved hand resting on Derek Hollis's arm, as if Evelyn had never once worn his promise ring on a ribbon around her neck. Father Gideon Vale had stood by the temple doors, his old face gray with warning. "This is not what the stairway is for," he had said. But Elder Shaw had lifted the silver book and declared that the pack could return an unclaimed burden to the moon before winter stores were counted. No one had challenged him. Not when Marianne said Evelyn's weakness had cost the family too much. Not when Brielle whispered that a one-armed Omega could never be a proper wife, mother, or mate. Not when Derek looked at the ground and said nothing at all. Silence had done more damage than cruelty. Evelyn remembered the cold weight of everyone watching as she was ordered to climb the first 20 steps alone. She had reached 14 before her bad balance failed her. No one helped. On the 17th step, the old scars around her shoulder burned so badly she could not breathe. On the 20th, Marianne took the handkerchief from Evelyn's collar, stared at the little blue sparrow, and for one soft second Evelyn thought her stepmother might remember that it had belonged to Evelyn's mother. Instead, Marianne tucked it back with a faint smile. Let her keep it. Even sacrifices deserve comfort. That word had emptied the courtyard. Sacrifice. Brielle had turned away first. Derek had followed. Then the pack, one by one, until Evelyn was left with Rain, Stone, and the small wounded bird hidden beneath her cloak. Now the rider waited for her answer, and the truth sat in her throat like a stone too large to swallow. "My family," she said at last. The words were barely louder than the rain. Something changed in him. Not movement, not expression, but the air around him tightened, as if a blade had been drawn inside the dark. "Your family has a strange understanding of mercy." Evelyn's laugh broke before it became sound. "They called it law." His gaze lifted to the temple above them. Cruelty often borrows sacred words when it wants witnesses to feel clean. No one had ever said such a thing in front of her. No one had ever named what happened without asking her to soften it first. Evelyn looked down because looking at him hurt in a different way. It stirred hope, and hope was dangerous on a mountain where she had already been abandoned. The sparrow fluttered weakly beneath her hand. The rider noticed. "You are freezing," he said, "and still you are protecting that bird. It is hurt." "So are you." Evelyn swallowed. "I am used to it." His jaw tightened beneath the shadow of his hood. Behind him, another rider appeared at the lower steps, broad-shouldered in royal armor, one hand resting near his sword but not drawing it. "Your Majesty," the guard called through the rain, cautious and urgent. Evelyn's breath caught. "Majesty." The word rolled across the stone and changed everything it touched. The man before her was not a wandering alpha, not a temple pilgrim, not a stranger passing through the storm. He was King Callum Mercer, the Alpha King whose judgments made territories tremble. Evelyn tried to bow from where she lay, panic rising hot through the cold. "I did not know." Callum stepped closer, and for the first time, his voice softened. "Then let that be the last thing you fear tonight." He lowered himself onto one knee in the rain, bringing his black cloak down around them like a wall against the storm. Evelyn clutched the sparrow, unsure whether to trust the hand he offered, unsure whether rescue could be real when it came after so much silence. But below them, royal steel flashed in the lightning, and above them, the temple bell gave one sudden, trembling note though no living hand had touched it. The temple bell trembled once, then surrendered the mountain to silence. Even the rain seemed to hesitate. King Callum Mercer remained on one knee before Evelyn Whitaker, his hands still extended, never urging, never pleading, simply waiting until the choice belonged to her. He had seen fear in countless forms across battlefields and royal courts. This was different. This was the fear of someone who had been taught that every offered hand eventually became another reason to fall. Evelyn stared at his scarred fingers. They carried no jeweled gloves, only the marks of old battles. Strange, she thought. A king whose hands looked like they had worked for every promise they ever made. She shifted the trembling sparrow deeper into the shelter of her cloak before placing her right hand into his. Callum did not pull her upward immediately. Instead, he matched the small pressure of her grip, allowing her to rise at her own pace. Her boots slipped across the rain-slick stone. Pain shot through the scar beneath her empty shoulder, and the world tilted. Before she struck the steps again, his free arms steadied her waist with effortless strength. Not possessive, not hurried, simply certain. "Easy," he said quietly. "The mountain has already taken enough from you." The words caught somewhere deep inside her. No one had spoken of what she had lost without reminding her of what everyone believed she could never become. She lowered her eyes. "I am sorry." A faint crease appeared between Callum's brows. "For falling." She nodded. "For making this difficult." Something unreadable crossed his face, gone almost before she noticed it. "Miss Whittaker," he said, his voice softer than before. "Being wounded is not the same as being difficult." The sentence settled into the empty places inside her where years of shame had lived. Below them, Captain Rowan Pike climbed the final steps with 3 royal guards. His boots splashed through shallow pools, but his attention stayed fixed on the king. "Your Majesty," Rowan said, lowering his head. "The road is secure." Callum never looked away from Evelyn. "Send a rider to Silverpine Hall." Rowan straightened. "Your orders?" "Every elder. Marianne Whittaker, Brielle Whittaker, Derek Hollis. They will present themselves before the crown at first light." Rowan hesitated only long enough to measure the weight of what that command meant. "Yes, Your Majesty." As the captain descended again, Father Gideon Vale emerged from the temple doors carrying an old lantern whose flames somehow refused to bow before the rain. His weathered eyes lingered on Evelyn with quiet sorrow. "I prayed someone would come before dawn," the old keeper admitted. "I simply did not expect it to be the Alpha King himself." Callum finally looked toward the temple. "Neither did I." That answer surprised Father Gideon. It surprised Evelyn even more. The king had not ridden here because prophecy called him. He had not arrived with an army searching for miracles. He had simply heard breathing where everyone else had accepted silence. The realization wrapped around Evelyn's heart with painful warmth. Father Gideon's gaze drifted toward the tiny sparrow peeking from Evelyn's cloak. "She protected that little creature all night," he said, "even after everyone abandoned her." Callum looked down for the first time. The bird's bent wing quivered against Evelyn's hand. His expression changed almost imperceptibly, not with pity but with recognition. Years ago, another frightened soul had hidden behind shaking hands, and he had arrived too late. The memory flashed through him so quickly that no one else could have recognized it. But Rowan, watching from below, saw his king's shoulders stiffen. "You should have left it," Callum said gently, though there was no judgment in his voice. Evelyn shook her head. "It was smaller than I was." He studied her for a long moment. Every report he had received about Silverpine described Evelyn Whittaker as broken, unstable, unfit to belong anywhere. Yet the woman standing before him had spent her final strength protecting something even weaker than herself. Powerful kingdoms were often built upon strength. The greatest ones, he had learned too late, survived because someone chose mercy first. A cold wind swept down the stairway. The sparrow suddenly lifted its head and gave one fragile chirp. At the same instant, pale silver lines hidden inside the ancient stone shimmered beneath Evelyn's feet, like moonlight trapped beneath clear ice. Rowan stopped halfway down the steps. Father Gideon's lantern trembled in his grasp. "Your Majesty," the old keeper whispered. "The stairway has not answered anyone in over 20 years." Evelyn looked down in alarm. "I did not do anything." "No," Callum replied, never taking his eyes off her. "You endured." The distinction mattered. It always would. The silver glow faded almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only rain and white stone behind. But something irreversible had already changed. Callum knew with absolute certainty that Silverpine had not abandoned an unwanted Omega. They had abandoned someone they had never bothered to understand. He slipped one arm beneath Evelyn's knees before she could protest and lifted her into the shelter of his cloak. She instinctively curled around the sparrow, protecting it even now. "Your Majesty," she whispered, startled. "You do not have to carry me." Callum adjusted the cloak around her against the cold. "Perhaps not." His silver eyes met hers with calm conviction. "But I will." The rain had begun to fade by the time King Callum Mercer reached the foot of the stairway, but no one moved. The wolves of Silver Pine stood frozen beneath the gray sky, as though the mountain itself had ordered them to witness what came next. Callum carried Evelyn Whitaker in his arms beneath his black cloak, shielding her from the cold as naturally as if there had never been another choice. Her head rested lightly against his shoulder, one trembling hand still protecting the tiny sparrow hidden beneath the folds of her cloak. She had long since stopped apologizing for her weight. Somehow, that simple silence felt like the first step toward healing. Marianne Whitaker was the first to recover. She stepped forward, her black cloak snapping sharply in the wind. "Your Majesty," she called, her voice carefully controlled. "There has been a misunderstanding. The girl belongs to Silver Pine." Callum did not slow his pace. He descended the final steps before answering. "No," he said quietly. "She does not belong to anyone." The words were spoken without anger, yet they settled over the gathering with more force than a shouted command. Marianne's expression tightened. "She is under my family's protection." Evelyn closed her eyes. Even now, the lie sounded painfully familiar. Callum finally stopped walking. He turned just enough for every wolf gathered below to see Evelyn's exhausted face resting safely beneath his cloak. Protection? His silver eyes swept across the crowd. "I found her alone on sacred stone while the storm was still trying to decide whether she would live through the night." No one answered, not because they disagreed, but because none of them could deny what they had all seen. Elder Shaw climbed down from the temple with measured steps, his ceremonial robes dragging through rainwater. "Your Majesty," he began. "Our traditions, your traditions," Callum interrupted calmly. "Left an unarmed, injured young woman to die." The old elder fell silent. For the first time in many years, words abandoned the man who had always hidden behind them. Brielle looked from Callum to Evelyn, uncertainty replacing the confidence she had worn only hours earlier. She had expected humiliation. She had never imagined reverence. Derek Hollis stood apart from the others, unable to take his eyes from Evelyn. He remembered every moment he had convinced himself silence was safer than courage. Watching another man carry her away with effortless certainty, he finally understood what his silence had truly cost. "Evelyn," he called, his voice breaking. She slowly opened her eyes. Their gazes met only for a heartbeat. Derek searched desperately for anger because anger might have meant he still mattered. Instead, he found something far more painful. Peace. She looked at him with the quiet sadness reserved for someone already left behind. Then she rested her head once more against Callum's shoulder. Derek lowered his eyes. The chance he had been waiting for no longer existed. Rowan Pike brought the king's horse forward. Before mounting, Callum adjusted the cloak around Evelyn so the rain could not touch her face. It was such an ordinary gesture that many watching wolves suddenly understood how extraordinary it truly was. He was not displaying power. He was offering care. Marianne took another step forward. "She is still an Omega of Silver Pine." This time, Callum faced her completely. "Look carefully." His voice remained steady, almost gentle. "You speak of her as though she were land to be claimed or property to be returned." His gaze hardened by only the smallest degree. "She is neither." The mountain fell silent again. Even the wind seemed to pause. Callum mounted the horse with practiced ease, keeping one arm securely around Evelyn while settling the cloak over both of them. She instinctively curled closer, not because she feared falling, but because for the first time in years she felt undeniably safe. Rowan handed the king the reins before stepping back. "Your Majesty," he asked quietly, "where shall we ride?" Callum looked once toward the towering white steps, where fear had ruled too long. Then he turned his horse away from Silver Pine. "Home," he answered. The single word echoed through the valley more powerfully than any royal decree. No one tried to stop him. The wolves simply watched as their alpha king carried away the woman they had abandoned, and with her, every excuse they had ever used to justify leaving kindness behind. The gates of Blackthorn Palace opened before dawn, not with the thunder of triumph, but with the quiet certainty of a place that had waited a long time for someone to return. Callum carried Evelyn through the entrance hall without once loosening his hold. Servants lined the walls in respectful silence, their eyes drawn toward the young Omega wrapped inside the king's black cloak. Some noticed the empty sleeve resting against her side. Others noticed the exhausted sparrow sleeping against her shoulder. No one dared whisper. One look from Callum was enough to remind every soul present that curiosity would never outweigh compassion beneath his roof. Warm air met Evelyn's face as the great doors closed behind them. She had forgotten what warmth felt like. The smell of cedar wood, fresh bread, and burning fireplaces drifted through the palace, so ordinary that it almost hurt. Home had once smelled like that before grief and fear changed its scent forever. "Your Majesty," an elderly steward said softly, stepping forward. "Which chamber shall we prepare?" "The East Chamber," Callum answered without hesitation. Several servants exchanged brief glances. Evelyn noticed, but said nothing. She had spent enough years learning how to read the conversations people hid inside their silence. As Callum climbed the sweeping staircase, she whispered, "Someone else already lives there." "No," he replied. "No one has lived there for many years." There was something in his voice that closed the subject before curiosity could become intrusion. The East Chamber overlooked the palace gardens, where winter roses slept beneath the last traces of snow. A fire already burned inside the stone hearth, filling the room with steady light instead of harsh brightness. Thick blankets rested across a wide bed. A rocking chair stood beside the window. Fresh flowers waited in a blue ceramic vase. Nothing about the room felt prepared in haste. It felt preserved, as though someone had always hoped it would be needed again. Callum lowered Evelyn carefully onto the edge of the bed, making certain both of her feet rested firmly on the floor before releasing her. The sudden absence of his arms left the room strangely cold. "I can manage from here," she said automatically. The words came so quickly she barely recognized them. Years of apologizing had become faster than breathing. Callum looked at her for a long moment. "Has anyone ever allowed you to simply rest?" Evelyn searched for an answer and found none. Tessa Marlowe entered quietly with clean bandages and dry clothing folded across one arm. Before crossing the room, she stopped several feet away. "Miss Whittaker," she said gently, "may I examine your shoulder?" The question stole Evelyn's breath. Permission. Such a small thing, yet no healer had asked it since she lost her arm. She nodded. While Tessa worked with patient hands, Callum turned toward the window, granting Evelyn privacy without leaving the room. Outside, dawn painted the gardens silver. His reflection lingered faintly in the glass, still, thoughtful, carrying a loneliness that did not belong inside a king surrounded by hundreds of people. A knock interrupted the silence. Captain Rowan Pike entered carrying a sealed message. "Silver Pine has answered," he said. "Elder Shaw refuses your summons. Marian Whittaker claims Miss Whittaker suffers from delusions brought on by injury. They demand she be returned immediately before she dishonors the territory." Evelyn closed her eyes. Even here, miles away, their voices reached for her. She expected anger from Callum. Instead, he broke the royal seal without haste, read every word, then walked to the fireplace. The parchment curled slowly into ash between his fingers. "Your Majesty," Rowan asked carefully, "what are your orders?" Callum slipped the heavy silver wolf ring from his finger and held it for a quiet moment. The polished metal caught the firelight, revealing faint scratches worn by years rather than ceremony. "Do you know why I never removed this?" he asked Rowan. The captain shook his head. "It belonged to my sister before it belonged to me. She believed a crown should protect the forgotten before it rewarded the powerful." His voice remained steady, but grief settled beneath every word. "The last time she asked for my help, I arrived too late." He placed the ring gently on the table beside Evelyn's mother's handkerchief. Two promises rested side by side, one inherited through blood, the other through love. "I will not fail again." Rowan bowed his head without speaking. Evelyn looked from the ring to the handkerchief and finally understood that she was not the only person carrying an old wound through this room. Callum turned back toward her, his silver eyes calm, unwavering. "From this moment forward," he said, "you are under the personal protection of the Alpha King. Not because you owe me gratitude. Not because I expect anything in return. Because no one who reaches this house will ever again wonder whether they are allowed to belong." Something inside Evelyn gave way, not from weakness, but from relief held back too long. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. She covered her face with her hand, embarrassed by them. Callum crossed the room, but did not touch her. He simply knelt until they were looking at one another without rank between them. "You never have to earn your place here," he said quietly. You already survived enough to deserve one. Outside the window, the first sunlight broke across the palace gardens, and for the first time since she had been left upon the white stone steps, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that coming home and being chosen were not always the same thing. Sometimes, the second was far more precious than the first. Morning settled gently over Blackthorn Palace, and for the first time in many years, Evelyn Whittaker woke without wondering whether she was welcome where she had opened her eyes. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floor of the east chamber, warming the blue handkerchief folded beside her bed. The little sparrow perched quietly on the windowsill, its injured wing still tucked close, recovering little by little instead of all at once. Somehow, that felt honest. Healing should take time. A soft knock came at the door before Mara Finch stepped inside carrying breakfast. The young Omega smiled shyly. "You slept through the night," she said. "The healers said that is the first real rest your body has had in a long time." Evelyn looked toward the fire, remembering another night years before, not in a palace but inside her father's forge. She had been 16 when a support chain snapped without warning. Her father had pushed a young apprentice out of the way, but Evelyn had reached him first. The falling iron beam crushed her left arm beneath its weight. By the time help arrived, the healers could save her life, but not the limb. People called it a tragic accident. Only later did Marianne begin calling it proof that the moon had marked Evelyn as incomplete. The memory passed as quietly as it had come. "You were thinking about your arm," Mara said carefully. Evelyn nodded. "Not because I miss it today." She smiled faintly. "Because I finally remembered why I lost it. I was trying to save someone." Before Mara could answer, hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. Captain Rowan Pike entered supporting a young palace guard whose breathing had become ragged and uneven. "This is Caleb Ross," Rowan explained. "His wolf refuses to settle after training. He cannot hear anyone." Caleb's frightened eyes darted wildly around the room. Every voice seemed to push him deeper into panic. Tessa Marlowe reached for him, but he recoiled before she could touch his shoulder. Evelyn watched him for only a moment before recognizing something painfully familiar. It was not rage she saw. It was shame. She knew that feeling too well. "Please," she said softly. "Give him some room." Rowan hesitated, then stepped back. The room immediately felt quieter. Evelyn crossed the floor slowly, careful not to move too quickly. "Caleb," she whispered. "Look at me." He could not. His breathing remained fast. Evelyn did not try again. Instead, she sat down on the rug several feet away, making herself smaller instead of asking him to become stronger. "When I lost my arm," she said gently, speaking more to the silence than to him. Everyone looked at what was missing. No one asked what I had tried to save. Caleb's breathing caught. "For a while," Evelyn continued, "I believed they were right. I thought surviving made me the problem." The room remained completely still. Even Rowan had stopped moving. After a long moment, Caleb slowly lifted his eyes. He was no longer looking through the people around him. He was looking at Evelyn. "They locked me away," he whispered. "They said I frightened everyone." "You frightened people because you were frightened yourself?" Evelyn answered. "Those are not the same thing." Caleb's shoulders began to shake. Then, quietly, the panic released him. No flash of light filled the room. No ancient magic swept through the palace. Only a frightened young wolf finally believing someone understood what he had never been able to explain. Rowan let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. "How did you do that?" he asked. Evelyn looked down at her hands. "I did not heal him." She smiled sadly. "I simply recognized him." A voice answered from the doorway. "That is exactly what a mercy bearer does." Callum stood there, having witnessed the final moments in silence. His silver eyes rested on Caleb before turning toward Evelyn. "My sister once told me that wounds become dangerous only after people stop being seen." He paused, the memory briefly shadowing his face. "I understood what she meant only after I lost her." Evelyn looked at him differently then. His grief no longer felt distant. It had shaped the man standing before her just as surely as the forge had shaped her. Rowan bowed his head toward Evelyn, not because she possessed some mysterious power, but because she had accomplished something every soldier respected. She had calmed fear without using force. Before anyone could speak again, another guard hurried into the chamber carrying a sealed message. "Your Majesty," he said, "delegates from Silverpine have arrived at the palace gates." Callum accepted the letter without opening it. Somehow, he already knew who had come. Rowan's expression hardened. Marianne Whitaker, Brielle Whitaker, Eldershaw, Derek Hollis. A heavy silence settled over the room. Evelyn looked toward the palace window where the distant mountain could just be seen beyond the trees. She realized then that the stairway had not finished with her yet. This time, however, she would not return as the frightened girl they had abandoned. She would return as the woman who finally understood that the greatest strength she carried had never been the arm she lost. It had always been the heart she refused to surrender. The throne hall had never felt so quiet. Hundreds of eyes followed Evelyn as she walked beside King Callum Mercer, yet the silence pressing against her was heavier than the whispers that had once followed her through Silverpine. Marianne Whitaker stood at the center of the chamber, dressed in black, her back perfectly straight. Brielle remained half a step behind her, beautiful but restless. Eldershaw clutched an ancient ritual book against his chest as though old pages could still protect old lies. Derek Hollis looked as if he had not slept since the night on the mountain. Before anyone spoke, Marianne took a single step toward Evelyn. It was only one step, almost polite, yet Evelyn's body reacted before her mind could. She moved back without thinking. A lifetime of instinct needed no permission. The motion lasted less than a heartbeat. Callum saw it. Without a word, he stepped between them. He did not draw a weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed himself in the space Evelyn's fear had created. The hall understood the gesture instantly. For the first time since the accident that had taken her arm, someone powerful had moved first so she would never have to. Marianne stopped walking. "Your Majesty," she said evenly. "I merely wish to speak to my stepdaughter." Callum never looked away from her. "Then you may do so from where you are." His voice remained calm, but it carried the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Eldershaw opened the ritual book with deliberate care. Silverpine petitions the crown for the immediate return of Evelyn Whitaker. She carries an unstable bloodline capable of disturbing sacred places and influencing wolves. Such gifts belong under pack authority. Gifts, Callum repeated softly. Interesting choice of words. A week ago your records described her as worthless. The old elder faltered. It was only a moment, but everyone saw it. Marianne answered before he could recover. "We protected our people." Caleb Ross rose slowly from his place beside the wall. "She protected me." His voice echoed farther than he expected. "When I lost control, she did not run." Mara Finch stepped beside him. "She protected me long before the palace ever knew her name." Another voice followed. Then another. Palace servants. Young guards. A kitchen maid. None spoke dramatically. They simply described the woman they had met since her arrival. A woman who listened before speaking. Who remembered names. Who thanked servants others never noticed. The room changed little by little, not because of speeches, but because ordinary people rarely agreed so completely unless they were telling the truth. Derek lowered his head. "They lied," he said hoarsely. Every face turned toward him. Marianne knew about the mercy-bearer bloodline. Eldershaw knew. They believed if Evelyn accepted years of shame, she would never discover what she really was. Marianne closed her eyes for the briefest instant. It was enough. "You promised," Derek whispered to her. "You said leaving her on the stairway would break the gift before it awakened." A ripple of disbelief swept across the chamber. Father Gideon Vale stepped forward carrying both silver law books. He opened the older volume to a page marked by faded blue thread. "Clara Whitaker came to me 20 years ago," he said. "She feared this very day. She entrusted me with the original record before she died." He lifted the fragile page where the image of a tiny blue sparrow had been carefully stitched into the margin. Mercy bearers were never meant to serve packs. They existed so no wolf would ever again be abandoned for being wounded. Evelyn felt her mother's handkerchief grow warm beneath her fingers. Not with magic, but with memory. Suddenly Marianne laughed, a tired, broken sound that carried no victory. "You all admire kindness because none of you ever had to keep a territory alive through winter," she said quietly. "Mercy feeds no one." Evelyn looked at the woman she had spent years trying to please and finally saw not a monster, but someone who had allowed fear to become her only language. She stepped around Callum before he could stop her. The guards shifted instinctively, but Callum raised one hand. He trusted her choice. Evelyn stood only a few feet from Marianne. "You were wrong," she said softly. "Mercy kept me alive when your strength could not." Marianne reached toward the blue handkerchief almost without thinking. Callum moved immediately, but Evelyn gently caught his wrist. No, it was the first time she had ever protected him from acting instead of the other way around. Marianne's trembling hand stopped in midair before slowly falling back to her side. Tears gathered in Brielle's eyes. Elder Shaw let the ritual book slip from his fingers onto the marble floor with a hollow sound that echoed through the hall like the ending of an old era. Callum turned toward the assembled court. At sunrise tomorrow, he declared, this judgment will return to the stairway where the lie began. Every truth hidden in Silverpine will be spoken beneath the same sky that witnessed its betrayal. He looked at Evelyn, not as a king issuing commands, but as a man asking whether she still wished to walk that path. She lifted her chin. The frightened woman abandoned on cold stone no longer stood in this room. I will return, she said. Not because they left me there. Her eyes met Callum's. Because I choose how my story ends. The next morning, the stairway to heaven looked exactly as it had the night Evelyn Whittaker was abandoned. The same white stone climbed toward the temple. The same pine trees whispered in the mountain wind. The only difference was the people standing upon it. This time, Evelyn was not alone. King Callum Mercer walked beside her, close enough that she could reach for him if she wished, yet careful never to take away the strength she had fought so hard to reclaim. Captain Rowan Pike and the Royal Guard remained several steps behind. Father Gideon Vale carried the restored law books. The people of Silverpine gathered quietly below, not because anyone ordered them to come, but because truth had finally become impossible to avoid. Evelyn stopped where the rain had once soaked through her dress. For a long moment, she simply looked at the stone beneath her feet. She remembered the cold, the silence, the lanterns disappearing into the darkness. She remembered believing that if she vanished, no one would notice. Then she looked beside her. Callum said nothing. He understood that some places could only be conquered in silence. Mara Finch stepped forward from the crowd first. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. I watched them leave you here, she admitted. I was afraid to speak. I have regretted that every day since. Evelyn reached for her hand. You are speaking now. One sentence lifted a burden that years of shame had never managed to loosen. Others followed. An elderly seamstress confessed she had sewn new dresses for Brielle while secretly mending Evelyn's old ones because she knew no one else would. A stable hand admitted he had hidden extra firewood outside Evelyn's cottage during harsh winters. Small acts, quiet kindnesses, proof that fear had silenced many hearts, but not every one of them. Father Gideon opened the ancient law before the assembled pack and read the forgotten passage aloud. No bells rang. No silver light crossed the stones. The truth no longer needed miracles to be believed. When he finished, Callum spoke only once. The false rite practiced here ends today. Under the crown, no wolf will ever again be abandoned in the moon's name. No one cheered. Some victories deserved reflection more than applause. Marianne Whittaker stood apart from everyone else. For the first time since Evelyn could remember, she looked smaller than the expectations she had spent years trying to protect. Slowly, she walked toward Evelyn and stopped several feet away. Neither woman spoke. Wind moved gently through the pines between them. Marianne's eyes drifted to Evelyn's empty sleeve before filling with quiet regret. Every time I looked at you, she said at last, I saw everything I feared losing. Evelyn listened without interrupting. I convinced myself that if I made you smaller, fear would become smaller too. Her voice broke. It never did. Silence returned. It stretched long enough for every person present to wonder whether forgiveness would come. Evelyn stepped closer, but not close enough to erase the years between them. I cannot give back the daughter you refused to see, she said softly. And I cannot pretend those years never happened. Marianne nodded, tears slipping quietly down her face. I know. Evelyn gently touched the blue handkerchief resting over her heart. But I will not carry your fear any farther than this mountain. It was not forgiveness. It was freedom. Brielle covered her face and wept without trying to hide it. Derek lowered his head, understanding there would be no words capable of repairing what silence had once destroyed. Callum watched without stepping forward. This moment belonged entirely to Evelyn. At the edge of the temple steps, the little sparrow lifted from Father Gideon's lantern and landed briefly upon Evelyn's shoulder before soaring into the clear morning sky. She smiled as she watched it disappear beyond the treetops. "Go," she whispered. "You do not belong to this mountain anymore." Father Gideon closed the ancient law books with quiet satisfaction. Rowan removed the ceremonial barriers from the stairway one by one. Wolves began walking freely across the steps that had once separated the worthy from the forgotten. As Evelyn turned away, she realized something unexpected. She no longer needed the mountain to remember what had happened there. She needed only to remember the woman who had walked back down it. Callum met her eyes with the smallest of smiles. No words were necessary. Side by side, they began the journey toward Blackthorn Palace, leaving behind not only the place where Evelyn had nearly lost her life, but the place where she had finally reclaimed it. When the road divided at the foot of the mountain, no one told Evelyn which way to go. One path led back toward Silverpine, where familiar houses stood filled with memories that no longer belonged to her. The other wound through the pines toward Blackthorn Palace, where nothing had ever belonged to her until someone chose to make room. Callum waited beside his horse without speaking. He had promised her protection. He would never demand her future. Evelyn stood quietly beneath the morning sky, her mother's blue handkerchief resting over her heart, while the little sparrow circled once above the trees before settling on a nearby branch. For the first time in years, every choice before her belonged to no one else. She smiled through tears she no longer tried to hide, and took the road toward Blackthorn. Callum did not reach for her. He simply fell into step beside her. Somehow, that felt even more precious than being carried. Spring arrived slowly across the kingdom. Snow retreated from the palace gardens, and green returned to the hills that had watched too many wolves leave believing they would never be welcomed home again. The abandoned East Wing became something entirely different. Its doors remained open from sunrise until evening for anyone who needed shelter, whether Omega, Beta, Alpha, Servant, or Soldier. Mara Finch welcomed frightened young Omegas with the same gentle voice she had once used while apologizing for entering Evelyn's room. Caleb Ross trained new guards, teaching them that strength without compassion always became another kind of weakness. Captain Rowan Pike quietly ordered every recruit to learn the names of the palace staff before learning ceremonial titles. Small changes spread farther than grand speeches ever could. Silverpine changed as well. Elder Sean never again held authority. The false rights disappeared from every territory under the crown. Marianne Whitaker surrendered the Whitaker estate without protest and spent her remaining years overseeing the refuge she had once resisted funding. Some wounds could never become friendships, but they no longer needed to become fresh injuries. Brielle wrote to Evelyn often. Sometimes Evelyn answered. Sometimes she did not. Forgiveness, she learned, did not grow because someone demanded it. It grew only where truth had first taken root. Derek never asked her to return. Instead, once each spring, a basket of wild blue flowers appeared outside the sanctuary gate without a note. She never looked to see who left them. She no longer needed old apologies to build a new life. Callum changed too, though few besides Evelyn noticed. He laughed more often. He no longer avoided the sound of temple bells drifting across distant valleys. Some evenings they walked together through the palace gardens without discussing politics, old grief, or mercy bearers. They simply watched birds settle into the trees before sunset. It became their favorite kind of conversation. On the first anniversary of the night she had been abandoned, the entire court gathered beneath the open sky instead of inside the throne hall. No jeweled throne waited there. Only the people whose lives had quietly changed because one wounded Omega had refused to let suffering become cruelty. Callum stepped forward carrying the silver wolf ring that had rested for a year beside her mother's handkerchief. "There is one promise," he said softly, "I have not yet fulfilled." Evelyn looked at him with the same steady courage that had first caught his attention on the mountain, when she had chosen to protect a frightened bird instead of herself. "The night I found you," he continued, "I carried you because you could not safely walk those steps alone. I have wished every day since then that your next journey would be different." He offered his hand, nothing more. "Walk beside me, Evelyn Whitaker. Not because you need saving. Because this kingdom is better when we build it together." She looked at the hand before her. Then she looked at the people surrounding them. Mara smiled through happy tears. Caleb stood proudly at attention. Rowan bowed his head with quiet respect. Father Gideon watched with the peaceful expression of a man who had lived long enough to see truth outlast fear. Evelyn placed her hand in Callum's. "I will," she answered. "Not because you carried me home." Her voice was steady enough for everyone to hear. "Because you taught me that home is the place where no one has to earn the right to belong." Instead of placing the royal ring upon her finger, Callum fastened it to the blue ribbon that already held her mother's handkerchief close to her heart. The old promise and the new one rested together. Above them, the sparrow lifted into the evening sky, its once broken wing carrying it effortlessly toward the fading light. Evelyn watched until it disappeared beyond the palace roofs. Then she turned, not toward the mountain where her story had almost ended, but toward the open doors of the sanctuary waiting behind her. This time, no one carried her across the threshold. She walked through it on her own, with Callum beside her, and together they entered the home they had chosen to build.